Hey, welcome to the channel. Two quick disclaimers before we begin. First, please be aware that this video will be filled with visual and narrative spoilers for both Netflix's Castlevania and Castlevania Nocturne, so you have been warned. Second, this video is, like everything on this channel, an opinion piece. You will probably hear things you disagree with. That's cool. All I ask is that you please refrain from accusing me of framing my own opinions as objective facts simply because I don't stick the phrase "in my opinion" into every single sentence. Cool? Cool. On to the video. I love Netflix's Castlevania. That probably shouldn't come as a surprise, as I'm a huge fan of the game series, so I'm also kind of, by definition, the target audience for this show, but I happen to think it's really great. It probably isn't as strong in a vacuum as I'd like to think it is, but as an adaptation of not only another piece of media, but a game series of all things, I think it's extraordinary. Dare I say, an actual milestone in game-to-television adaptation. I've felt this way since the debut of the original series all the way back in 2017, and I continue to feel this way now at the conclusion of Season 2 of Nocturne. But despite all that, Nocturne's probable finale had me reassessing the series' potential as a continuing adaptation in light of what I perceive to be a potentially fatal error in judgment on the part of the writing staff. But we'll get to that in just a bit. First, however, I want to break down what I love about the series and why I think it works so well, broadly speaking, as an adaptation specifically. Just to clarify, going forward I am going to refer to the original series, the Trevor Belmont Saga if you will, as Series 1, since it has no subtitle, and I'll be referring to Richter's Saga as Nocturne. While I really enjoyed my time with both, I have a fairly pronounced preference for Series 1, and the reasons for this tie into my central thesis here. Series 1 was, in my opinion, the single greatest game-to-television adaptation of all time, full stop, especially the first two seasons. Seasons 1 and 2 of Series 1 collectively served as an adaptation of Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse, but used that title as more of a narrative framework on top of which to really build out the world and expand on characters and events from that period in the series' overarching timeline. Castlevania, while a fairly lore-rich franchise, has always been extremely light on plot and characterization when it came to the games themselves. In this regard, they don't really lend themselves to direct narrative adaptation, but they lend themselves extremely well to loose narrative adaptation. And Series 1 understands this very well. While its general narrative throughline for the first two seasons is ostensibly a reimagining of Castlevania 3, it sprinkles in elements from its sequel, Curse of Darkness, and even from the fan-favorite entry Symphony of the Night. Curse of Darkness is, of course, represented by way of the Devil Forge Masters Hector and Isaac, who I will touch on momentarily, and Symphony of the Night is represented not necessarily by Alucard himself, as he did make his game series debut in Castlevania 3, but by Alucard's relationship with his father, and the subplot surrounding his mother's death. While Trevor Belmont is ostensibly the central hero of the show, being the character whose perspective we follow among the vampire hunting trio, Alucard is notably the character to actually receive the final confrontation with Dracula, and this decision is what really makes me feel like Series 1 is channeling the spirit of Symphony just as much as Dracula's Curse at times, despite Symphony actually taking place much later in the timeline. Hector and Isaac being adapted into the show's world came as a delightful surprise, not only because I'm a huge fan of Curse of Darkness, but because their presence meta-contextually signaled that the writers had a genuinely deep knowledge of and passion for the lore of the games, as your average suit at Konami probably doesn't even remember that these two exist, given the niche status and low sales of their PS2 era origin. But what was really cool about seeing them here, in my opinion, was that Series 1 served as a chronicle of their actual time serving Dracula, as well as an exploration of each of their respective motivations for doing so. Granted, these explanations aren't necessarily canon to the games, but the games didn't exactly give them much to work with, did they? In Curse of Darkness, Richter has already turned to the side of good, and the story never really explores why he ever served Dracula in the first place. Even his turn is aimed squarely at Isaac, not Dracula himself, and is a fairly selfish revenge tale revolving around his dead wife, not any large-scale atrocities that either of them would have committed as Forge Masters. Now, Isaac's adaptation into Series 1 appears much less faithful on the surface, and admittedly it is, but in fairness, the original Isaac, I'm not sure how one would go about directly translating him into a show with this particular tone. His visual changes are much more stark, which I think many fans find distracting, but personally, I vastly preferred his characterization in the show to his characterization in the game. Ironically, the game made him out to be, shall we say, highly flamboyant, but never actually explored his sexuality, while his Netflix counterpart isn't a flame at all, but actually explored his gay identity a little bit. I don't really have much to say about that, I just thought it was kind of funny and ironic. I also thought it was kind of funny and ironic that none of the Curse of Darkness purists I saw online had any real complaints about Richter, even though he's arguably just as different from his Curse of Darkness counterpart as Isaac is, but maintains a much more faithful visual design. Richter in the game, while still a Devil Forge Master, is a lot more feisty. He's a warrior and has more of a firebrand personality. Netflix's Richter, while still bearing some aspects of his original counterpart's prideful persuasion, is a much quieter and more pensive character. And he isn't equal parts Forge Master and warrior, the way his game counterpart is. To be clear, I had absolutely no issue with these alterations to his character because he served a very particular role in the narrative and served it well, but I did notice them. Anyway, a lot of Series 1's more background fan service came in the designs of the various night creatures, many of which, though never addressed by name, were clearly based on classic Castlevania enemies and bosses. Slagra and Gaibon, Malphus, Gurgoth, and Legion come to mind offhand, but I'm sure there were plenty of others mixed in among the more generic ones. The fighting styles of the heroes and Dracula himself also deserve a special mention in this department, as virtually every spell and attack that these characters throw out over the course of the series are clearly based on something they could do in the source material. The characterizations of the protagonists as well, though, were a real standout element of Series 1. The performances were excellent across the board, and a healthy helping of dry wit from all of them helped lighten the mood of what could at times be a very grimdark sort of tale. For the most part, these personalities were essentially created from scratch, because this entire trio is functionally mute in Castlevania 3, and yet I felt that each of their personalities fit how I would have imagined them to a T. Trevor is bold and brash, Sypha is confident and calculating, and Alucard is broody and at times distant, but all of them are caring and capable. Sometimes they bicker, but they always conduct themselves professionally in battle. There are times when Alucard acts a bit more edgy and snarky than I think most fans would imagine him to, but it's important to remember that in Series 1, he is actually roughly as young as he looks. He may be immortal, but he's basically an actual teenager here. He hasn't yet lived even one human lifetime, much less multiple, so this is the one and only point in the timeline where it's reasonably possible to explore any of these traits on his character at all. Of course, there are other oddball adaptations, such as the Count Saint-Germain, who have very little in common with their original counterparts, and while Series 1 does take the liberty of inventing some characters here and there in order to flesh out the world, it also makes some very tasteful alterations to existing quote-unquote characters like Carmilla, who were basically blank slates in the first place. And even among the characters who did receive extensive reworks, I feel that their original spirits were still kept intact. Isaac, for example, still loves his work and is fiercely loyal to Dracula, and Saint-Germain is still mysterious and charismatic. The show recontextualizes the feud between Hector and Isaac, but the feud itself remains, and it alters the details of what exactly death is, but in doing so, it creates a motivation for him to serve Dracula and seek his revival that actually makes sense. All in all, what I'm trying to get at is that as an adaptation, Series 1 understands the assignment, especially within its first 2 seasons. It is as direct as it can reasonably be with the vast majority of characters and events, and invents compelling backgrounds and characterizations in cases where the showrunners had a hollow shell of a character and basically not a single deeper layer to work with. And although seasons 3 and 4 basically had to invent entirely new plot lines and scenarios, the core cast was already so charming and well realized that I was more than happy to follow them on whatever adventures the writers had cooked up. Which leads us into Nocturne, which, while it definitely has its fans, and I count myself among them, has proven to be much more contentious to the larger fanbase from what I've been seeing online. Broadly speaking, there are 2 major reasons for this, I think. Number 1 is that it's less tightly written than Series 1, but number 2 is that it invents a lot more and takes many more liberties with the primary source material, that being Rondo of Blood. Regarding point number 1, I'm admittedly inclined to agree. Nocturne is noticeably sloppier than Series 1, even taken in a vacuum. Compelling plot threads are set up only to be abandoned, Maria's vampirized mother probably being chief among these, and at times even blatant lore inconsistencies are formed, chief among these being everything surrounding the mechanics of night creatures and devil forgery. Oh my god, this even drove me crazy. It was probably my single biggest issue with Nocturne. The funny thing is, I really didn't mind the idea of Edward being like the sole defective night creature in Abbot Emmanuel's personal militia. Emmanuel does use a machine to do his forging, and machines are nothing if not notoriously prone to malfunction. Even Isaac in Series 1 accidentally created a single oddball creature with the power of speech and some lingering fragments of their own past. But Nocturne really breaks all the rules. A whole bunch of night creatures seem to maintain their human memories and personalities, and somehow there is seemingly no mechanism in place to ensure the loyalty of the ones which do this. And the fact that vampires can apparently not only be revived by devil forgery, but become more powerful and immune to sunlight without even being beholden to their forge master is just absolute bullshit. That plot point alone got me to rethink the concept of night creatures not being burnt by the sun as being a good idea. I mean, they're called night creatures, for God's sake. But while I acknowledge all of this, I do want to point out that when addressing point number 2, Nocturne's source material gave the writers infinitely less to work with than Series 1's already stark pickings did. Between the 3 protagonists, R.I.P. Grant, Dracula, Lisa Tepish, Hector, Isaac, Saint Germain, and I suppose Carmilla, Series 1 had a solid handful of leads and supporting characters built into the time period of its source material to expand on, and construct a world and narrative around. Nocturne, for better and mostly worse, just isn't so fortunate. Rondo of Blood is a fan-favorite classic Vania, and for good reason, but it's also highly emblematic of the game franchise's relationship with storytelling and characters in general. The only characters really built into it are Richter Belmont and Maria Renard. Annette technically existed in Rondo, but she was this nothing-burger damsel in distress with no proper characterization. So even if the showrunners hadn't chosen to completely reinvent her, she wouldn't realistically have had anything meaningful to contribute in a more directly adapted form. I would also say the same goes for Terra, who truly doesn't share a damn thing with her original counterpart aside from her name and gender. Dracula is supposed to be a factor in Richter's story, more on that in a bit, but since Nocturne has decided to abstain from using him in this narrative, he's simply not available for a more direct adaptation. I do think that the decision to import Erzsébet Bathory from Castlevania Bloodlines worked quite well overall for Nocturne's purposes, and she continues the trend of the Netflix canon's female villains being somehow infinitely crueler than Drac himself. Again, more on that in a bit. My personal favorite piece of fan service in Nocturne, however, was simply the inclusion of Juste Belmont. As a fan of the full game canon, I was just really stoked to see Juste adapted at all, because let's face it, there was no way this guy was ever going to get his own series. This was pretty much the only way we would ever end up seeing him on screen, and the fact that we got Juste adapted before Simon is wild. Like, bro, we got Juste Belmont on TV before GTA 6. What is this timeline? And I thought they did this version of him decent justice in terms of characterization and skill set. After all, he is an incredibly potent magician in his game of origin, and I appreciated that the writers were even able to work Liddy and Maxim into his tragic backstory, even if only via lip service. Touches like this are still extremely appreciated nods to the source material for mega fans like me. Anyway, the last quote-unquote directly adapted character in Nocturne is also the one to receive something resembling the Isaac treatment, and that would be Olrox. Again, this is a case where I think a lot of fans lament how unfaithful he is to the games, but like, bro, come on, be reasonable. Olrox is a nothing character in the games. He's a mute filler boss in Symphony of the Night. Talk about giving the writers absolutely nothing to work with. The only thing he really had baked into him was a fondness for wearing purple and the use of that floating skull attack spell, which they kept. If anything, my problem with Olrox is that he's so intriguing, and yet nothing is really done with him. Something I really liked about Nocturne's largely original story was the way most of the central heroes each had a personal nemesis vampire with a direct connection to their past. Terra has Erzsébet, Annette has Comte de Ventblanc, and Richter has Olrox. As the vampire who murdered Richter's mother right in front of him during the prologue, I was expecting Olrox to have a much larger role, or at least more actual agency within the plot. And Nocturne's very first promotional press release even teased the idea that Richter would have to form an uneasy alliance with his mother's killer. In the end, however, all Olrox really did was feed Richter a little bit of information in Season 1 and assist a little with the last moments of the final battle of Season 2. It didn't feel like much of an alliance at all. Now, in fairness, Olrox is characterized as calculating, jaded, and most critically, fairly risk-averse, but I felt that this handling of him rather deflated the importance of an extremely layered and intriguing character, unfortunately. Hell, Emmanuel ended up having a much more critical role in the plot, and I thought he was surprisingly well-written and believable. I would have liked to know how the fuck a Catholic priest ended up with the blueprints for a demon manufacturing assembly line, but overall I thought he was really well written as this quote-unquote man of God with an insanely distorted yet chillingly believable sense of right and wrong and interpretation of religious scripture. Drolta immediately being resurrected at the start of Season 2 with no negative repercussions was a total cop-out, but the reveal that she was really the mastermind behind Erzsébet was extremely Zigbar-coded, so it actually gave me a bit of a chuckle. Also, Maria pulling a DMC Dante with the pink dress. This is a side note, but I personally am so happy that they decided to go with Ayami Kojima's redesigns for Richter and Maria, while just adding Richter's white headband back in towards the Season 1 finale. This is just a personal taste thing, but as someone who came to the Castlevania series through the Igarashi Metroidvania era, I vastly prefer Kojima's art style and character design sensibilities, shifting the franchise away from its campy 80s Conan the Barbarian look to a more modern gothic one. It just suits the franchise more, in my opinion, and I'd even go as far as to say that I'm a little bummed out that Konami later opted to have her redraw Simon and Richter with their original looks in her art style. It's not that I think OG Richter looks bad by any means, but compared with Kojima's reimagining, he just looks like Ren Fair Ryu to me now. Anyway, my point is that the less the writers had to work with, the more they had to invent. Accusing Nocturne of not being direct enough of an adaptation is missing the forest for the trees, in my opinion. If anything, you should be accusing the team of choosing to adapt Rondo of Blood in the first place, if they had so little to work with that they would have to invent like 90% of it. And this brings me to the current dilemma. Where does Netflix's Castlevania go from here? When Series 1 first wrapped up, I had a personal wish list in my head, one that I believed was generous but still feasible. What I really wanted to see was an adaptation of Rondo into Symphony of the Night, if possible, Portrait of Ruin with significant flashbacks to bloodlines worked into its essential narrative, and eventually Aria of Sorrow, with flashbacks to Julius Belmont's Battle of 1999, and perhaps Dawn of Sorrow adapted as a potential bonus if Soma's series ran enough seasons. However, all of these ideas were predicated on the assumption that Castlevania's most consistent leading man would remain in the spotlight, that being Count Vlad Dracula Tepish. One of the things that remains so interesting and unique about the Castlevania game franchise to this day is that only its villain is featured consistently. See, most franchises feature a recurring hero squaring off with multiple adversaries, but in Castlevania, this player relationship is reversed. Dracula is immortal, and so the series spans entire centuries and features new heroes from entry to entry. There's still some sense of through line between recurring bloodlines, such as the Belmont, Belnades, and Morris clans, and the series' sole immortal hero in Dracula's own son, Alucard. But by and large, you generally don't play the same character from game to game. Dracula is the franchise's real through line, alongside its actual namesake, his semi-living castle, also known as Castlevania. But Series 1 did something very unexpected and peculiar, which ended up shooting the broader franchise in the foot, I think. It actually wrote Dracula too well. Ironically, his characterization was too good and fleshed out. He was too sympathetic in his own way, oftentimes portrayed as melancholy, lonely, and resigned. Even that flashback to his glory days of youthful violence made it a point to show that he only really hunted people who personally offended him, and even made a point of sparing their wives and kids. I mean, Jesus Christ. And by the time of his death at Alucard's hands, Dracula was just sort of too arced out to do anything else with. By the Season 2 finale, he had a real sense of sorrow and remorse. If nothing else, he was genuinely tired of the killing. He was tired of the hatred and the violence. His attempted genocide never gave him pleasure to begin with. From the very beginning, he was simply lashing out at the people who took his wife from him. And as a result of this, the game franchise's core premise, its core conceit, was essentially destroyed. In the games, no matter how many times he is defeated, Dracula resurrects every 100 years, offer not valid after 1999, because his hatred and his malice are eternal. He continues to despise humanity, he never learns his lesson, and he develops a sort of ongoing rivalry with the Belmont clan, and continues to persist as a quote-unquote living legend even among other vampires and creatures of the night. But this isn't who he is in Netflix's Castlevania anymore, so now we have a bit of a problem for the franchise's longevity. How do you continue directly adapting titles while eschewing their primary antagonist and arguable main character? I'm not saying that Dracula absolutely needs to be in every title, but none of them? How do you adapt Symphony of the Night if Alucard has already had that arc during the events of Dracula's Curse? How do you adapt the Battle of 1999 if Dracula has already been permanently dead for thousands of years? And what's even the point of adapting Aria of Sorrow if the man Soma is a reincarnation of has no lasting legacy in universe? I still think that a Bloodlines portrait crossover season could work, but now Bathory has been used up from John and Eric's story, and Bronner's gonna need some serious rewrites to be at all intimidating without Dracula and Death waiting in the wings to usurp him. I guess what I'm trying to say is that as much as I love Netflix's Castlevania, and make no mistake, I do, I'm not really sure that they thought ahead enough to continue stringing it along successfully in the long term. I really do think that completely eradicating Dracula right off the bat was probably their biggest mistake, but it's compounded by the fact that they're adapting a franchise which notoriously gives the writers relatively little to work with in the first place. Series 1 will forever remain a milestone in game-to-television adaptation, in my eyes. An absolute masterpiece, warts and all, aside from the very final scene of Season 4. Oh my god, fuck that scene. Finding the balance between remaining a faithful adaptation and allowing the project to take on a life of its own is a tricky thing, but I think Series 1 does it successfully. Seasons 3 and 4 probably could have trimmed some fat, but I was still never bored watching them. I think that Nocturne did an admirable job with the hand it was dealt, and I still found it thoroughly enjoyable as a series fan. But in many ways, Series 1 was lightning in a bottle in terms of its potential. A healthy amount of protagonists, a healthy amount of supplementary source material, some of the most fun and intriguing villain perspective scenes and episodes in just about any series, and an extremely tasteful, if short-sighted, importing of elements from further down the timeline. I'm not even saying that they made the wrong decision putting everything they had into Series 1, when that cast was so innately likable, and there was nothing even resembling a guarantee that they'd be able to take the series as far as they ultimately did. But now that they've arrived further down the timeline, it's only going to get harder to adapt directly, especially now that they've permanently destroyed their leading villain and borrowed one of his very few substitutes from one of the only eras left with enough characters to really build a story around. The Belmonts will always be there, I suppose, but without their chief rival and his titular castle, well, is it really still Castlevania? Hey guys, as always, thanks for watching, and an extra big thank you if you stuck around long enough to hear this. It's time for the obligatory algorithm shill, so you know what to do with those like and subscribe buttons, but I'd also love to hear what you think of Netflix's Castlevania adaptation, if you care to leave a comment. I say this all the time, but it's true. I make these videos to have a conversation, and I actually engage with my audience, so if you leave a comment, I will see it. I'm really curious how people feel about this franchise and its potential for future seasons. Which games would you most want to see adapted? And how do you think Netflix should handle this franchise going forward? Let me know if you're feeling so inclined, and have a spooky day regardless. Peace out, vampire hunters.